email address is on the handout. I can claim no special knowledge of Wadi Sarga. This paper will first describe the state of research of the monastery of Abba Thomas at Wadi Sarga, and then present a list of its superiors based on Coptic inscriptions and documents. The ruins of the monastery of Abba Thomas are situated on the west bank of the Nile, about 26 kilometers southeast of Asyut and 1.5 kilometers from the edge of the cultivation at the mouth of the Wadi Sarga. The wadi runs parallel to the desert cliffs in a southerly direction and then turns abruptly to the east, where it opens to the Nile Valley. The quarries on both sides of the wadi appear to have been exploited from the Old Kingdom to the late New Kingdom and were adapted in late antiquity for the construction of a monastery. The Coptic texts from the site reveal that the settlement was a koinonia called the Monastery or Holy Monastery of Abba Thomas and the Rock of Abba Thomas. It was supposedly named after its founder, a certain Abba Thomas, and was inhabited until about the 8th century. The site was excavated during the winter of 1913-1914 under the supervision of Reginald Campbell Thompson for the Byzantine Research Fund. The architect F.A. Richards intended to map the area, but the outbreak of World War I interrupted his work, with the result that he could only make a general sketch. It does not show the discoveries made outside of the wadi on the north side, such as a later church, a small villa, wall paintings, an old well, and a scenery. In short, the archaeological finds still remain unpublished. But when Walter Crum and Harold Idris Bell edited the Greek and Coptic texts from Wadi Sarga, they included an introduction to the excavations by Thompson and the sketch map by Richards. As you can see on the slide, I, that is to say Renate, added some colors to the sketch map for the sake of clarity. It indicates a caved church, small houses and large buildings on the southern side of the wadi, and two groups of houses and a large pillared cave on the north side. A large rectangular building below the church was called a stable by Thompson's workers, meaning a stable for the beasts of burden of a caravan. Finally, there were throwouts or dump heads at various places, which yielded hundreds of ostraca, many papyri, and some vellum fragments. An elaborate description of the site and black and white photographs were published by Jean Dorès in his study on the monasteries in Middle Egypt. Dorès visited Wadi Sarga in 1951 and closely observed the buildings, the wall paintings in the caves, and inscriptions. This slide and the following one will give a general impression of what the site looked like. Here we have a view on the southern flank of the wadi with large buildings, the cave church and the stable at the background, and remains of houses on the northern flank at the right. This is a closer view on the large buildings, the entrance of the cave church and its interior, with the decorated apse at the back. The wall painting in the conch depicted the Last Supper, while the upper sections of the surrounding walls were decorated with the figures of saints. The following photographs show the two groups of houses on the northern slope of the wadi. It is most fortunate that Dorès took these photographs and that they have been published, for Wadi Sarga is presently used by the military and is therefore inaccessible. When Dietrich and Rosalie Clem analyzed the limestone at the site, they could only visit the northern quarries, for the southern ones had been walled up. They were not allowed to take photographs. During the 10th International Congress of Coptic Studies in Rome last September, Elizabeth O'Connell presented an excellent paper on the finds from Wadi Sarga at the British Museum and the British Library. She also listed a number of current projects on this material by external scholars. Jane Fayers has studied pottery and is now working on the glass. Gillian Pike is studying the tracings of the wall paintings. Jenny Cromwell focuses on the unpublished ostraca and on part of the vessel notations. Tasha Voorstrasse is examining the Arabic documents and the coins found at the site. Jean-Luc Fournet has studied the vessel notations of late Roman amphorae. And at the Congress, Elizabeth herself spoke about establishing where the various founds exactly came from on the basis of the excavation notes. Voilà. It should be added that part of the taxable sources relating to the monastery of Abba Thomas were not discovered during the excavations, but purchased from antiquities dealers. Isolated Coptic papyri ended up in the John Ryland Library in Manchester, the University of Michigan, and the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, which purchased several manuscripts from the Swedish antiquities dealer Erik von Scherming. Two pieces of papyrus certainly relate to the monastery of Abba Thomas and were used by Paul, presumably a monk, who hesitated whether he should go to Antinoe or stay at the monastery of Abba Thomas. After invoking God Almighty, he would pick one of the pieces and do what was written on it. Now that the state of research has been discussed, we will turn our attention to the leaders of the monastery. Walter Crum, who edited the Coptic texts from the site, already assumed that the monastery was named after its founder, Abba Thomas, whose identity cannot be further specified. Abba Thomas is invoked as an intercessor on many of the commemorative stelae that were found in the houses on the northern side of the Wadi. These slabs either record the death of members of the community, or a prayer that God may bring their lives to a good end. The beginning of the inscriptions contains an invocation of the Holy Trinity, or good God, and a variable list of saints, which often ends with local monastic saints. The invocation of Abba Thomas has changed in the course of time, for names were added in several stages. Twice it is simply Abba Thomas and his brethren. One inscription, it's two on the slide, one inscription lists Thomas, Peter, Joseph and Anouk. They are all called Abba, but for the sake of clarity, titles are left out here. 8 stelae recorded the names of Thomas, Peter, Joseph, Anouk and Pamoon, and the names added afterwards are Germanus, Justus, Enoch, and the name starting with M. Crum observed that some of these names also appear in the Coptic documents from Wadi Sarga, but he was not sure whether the people invoked were contemporaries or a group of successive officials. However, the gradual development of the invocation formula strongly suggests that these men were indeed successive officials or even superiors of the monastery of Abba Thomas. At any rate, when they died, they were commemorated in the houses. The list of names provides an excellent starting point for a relative chronology, but since none of the stelae bears a complete date, only days and months, clues for dating must be derived from other textual sources, Coptic literary manuscripts and documents. The literary manuscript, a parchment book, is presently kept at the British Museum and dates to the first half of the 7th century. In the 10th century, however, it was reused at Der Surian for writing Syriac texts. The manuscript contains several books from the Old Testament, including the book Esther, which is followed by a list of names: Abba Thomas, Abba Peter, Abba Joseph, and Abba Mena. Crum assumed that the first 3 names refer to the Thomas, Peter, and Joseph of Wadi Sarga. And since the script points to a date in the early 7th century, Crumb suggested that Thomas lived shortly before 600 AD. As for Mena, who is not commemorated at Wadi Sarga, perhaps he was the scribe. Before discussing the Coptic documents, I would like to draw your attention to Papa Victor of Hage, presumably a priest whose name appears on 3 stelae commemorating Appa Pamun. It is likely that the stelae date to the time of Pamun's successor, Appa Germanus. Victor of Hage, surnamed the Little, was either the dedicator or the sculptor of the slabs. One of the inscriptions dates to the indiction year 13. Another contemporary set of stelae records prayers for a group of people, including the priests Voibamon and Benoffer and Anoop the baker. At least some members of the group came from the Fayoum. Now we will examine the Coptic documents that refer to superiors of the monastery. P. Sarga 375 is the beginning of a letter from Appa Eunomius, Bishop of Specht, modern Koningsvaart, to a superior and second in authority of the monastery of Appa Thomas, whose names are regrettably lost. All we can conclude from this text is that the monastery of Appa Thomas was situated in the diocese of Specht, and that the second in authority, or steward, was apparently considered an important official. The rest of the letter is lost. Appa Justus, the 7th leader on our list, is named in 6 documents, 5 written on ostraca and 1 on papyrus. The text on papyrus, P. Rylands 201, is an acknowledgement of a debt by the superior Justus, who represents the monastery of Appa Thomas. This document is dated to the 13th addiction year, a detail that could be useful for a chronological study in the future. Abba Enoch, the 8th superior, is probably best attested, but hard to distinguish from Enoch, his steward, because his titles are rarely used. But he must have sent instructions to the steward Enoch, to another steward Patnute, and to Abba Mina for the delivery of goods. The last superior on the list could have been Abba Amun, father of the rock of Appa Thomas, who appears in P. Rylands 248, a letter about the donation of the garden to the monastery. Monastic sub-superiors who were not commemorated on the stelae include Sarga of the rock of Appa Thomas, who sent a letter to his superior, an argumendrite, Appa George the argumendrite, who paid the taxes due from the monastery of Appa Thomas, Appa Victor, argumendrite of the Holy Mountain, which does the Coptic toll, which does not necessarily refer to the monastery of Appa Thomas, which is called Petra, rock, but never toll. Daniel, the argumendrite who employed a carpenter and who issued a poll tax demand. Cyrus, simply called our father, who issued 2 poll tax receipts. Daniel and Cyrus were in office in the Islamic period, most probably in the first half of the 8th century, in about the same period when Qura ibn Sharik was governor of Edfustat, 708 to 740. Qura ibn Sharik is known, among many other things, from an official Arabic letter that was found at Wadi Sarga. From our overview, it would seem that the leader of the monastery of Appa Thomas was first called superior and later argumendrite, an observation that also applies to the Balaiza and the monastery of Appa Apollo at Bawit. It is not unlikely, however, that these and other monasteries in the neighborhood formed a monastic federation with a single argumendrite at the main monastery on the Holy Mountain. Then, the other communities were supervised by superiors who were subordinate to him, as the letter sent by Sarababon suggests. Perhaps the monastery of Apollo at Bawit was the monastic center, for one of its superiors was Daniel the Archimonrite, who was perhaps the same person as the Daniel attested at Wadi Sarga. Be that as it may, the Coptic documents discussed here show that the Archimonrite was responsible for paying the taxes of the monastery of Abba Thomas. On the basis of this overview, we can draw the following conclusions. The invocations on the Coptic commemorative stelae from Wadi Sarga present a list of 9 superiors of the monastery of Abba Thomas, from Thomas the founder to Abba Amun. The 3 superiors at the end of the list, Justus, Enoch and Amun, also appear in Coptic documents from Wadi Sarga. In addition, these documents attest to other monastic leaders, including Sarababel, father of the rock, and several Archimonrites. The list of names is a useful starting point for reconstructing the relative chronology of the monastery, and the few indiction years recorded in the Coptic text can be used in the future to propose some absolute dates. Before we can sketch the history of the site, however, it is essential that the unpublished material is also examined, and that the relationship between this monastery and the other ones near Asyut is clarified. It is excellent news that various scholars are now working on the unpublished material in the British Museum and the British Library. I'm looking forward to hear about their results. And I thank you also on behalf of Renate.
Thank you very much for this valuable contribution. And as at the beginning, you have the email of Renate Dekker to ask her about any questions. We have 2 minutes or so before we leave. So dinner will be 7:30, and I prefer tomorrow also breakfast 7:30 because we will leave 12 o'clock.
Or earlier if you can.